No. You do what you've got to do, and I might do a follow-up with you as well. Ladies and gentlemen, wow, thank you so much indeed for the World Economic Forum giving me this amazing opportunity to speak to these amazing people in this amazing location at what is, let's be brutally honest about it, the most stunning of times. In the last 24 hours, the start of a seismic quake which could change the world has just happened. I'm determined not to make this entire panel about Donald Trump, but I'm torn, and I was awake half the night wondering, do they want Donald Trump? Do we just go for it on Trump, or do we just actually put him in context of the rest of the world? And I think that's where I'm going to go with this as well, because there are so many important things going on here in Europe, in the Middle East, in the United States, regardless of who the president is, in Asia as well. And we've got so many concerns about whether China is going to make it to 4.6% this year, whether they really made it to 5% last year as well. So there are growth drivers and growth challenges absolutely everywhere we look. We have 44 minutes to discuss this. I'm going to give you a lot of chance at the end to ask some questions as well. I'll ask you in advance, keep them brief, and I'll get more questions through. My panel, I've met all of them now, 3 of them previously, 1 of them I've just met, and it's been a real honor to do so as well. And the best panels are where the moderator shuts up and the panelists really go for it amongst themselves. I will endeavor to do that. I talk for a living, as my boss knows, so I will do my best to listen and try and guide the conversation rather than dictate the conversation as well. Let me just tell you who the panelists are. His Excellency Faisal Al Ibrahim is the Minister of Economy and Planning for the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Sir, it's lovely to meet you. Anna Botín, I've had the honour of meeting on many occasions. She is the incredibly robust and forthright Executive Chair of Santander, also Chair of the WEF International Business Council. Adina Friedman, we had the pleasure of meeting last year, and we've met many times before, Chair and CEO of the NASDAQ. If growth is going to come from anywhere, it's going to come from innovation, it's going to come from technology. I think it's going to come from the private sector more than the public sector. We can discuss that as well. And Lawrence H. Summers, Larry Summers needs no introduction as well. Charles W. Eliot, University Professor, Harvard Kennedy School of Government, and of course, amongst many roles, former US Treasury Secretary. Good to see you, Larry, as well. Let's just go down the line. We'll start very basically and open this conversation up. I'll start with His Excellency here as well, is growth. Where do you see where we're at? Where do you see the challenges? And obviously you'll put that in context, in the global context, and in the context of where the kingdom is at the moment, sir.
Sure, thank you very much, Steve. It's a great pleasure to be here. I think, you know, we need to acknowledge today growth is tepid, as Kristalina mentioned or described it, the tepid 20s that we're in when she was in Riyadh in the World Economic Forum event in April. Today between 3.2 and 3.3%. That's well below the historical average of 4%. It may seem like a little, but over a long period of time, that is significant. And it begs the question, what do we do about this growth, and what do we need to do to get out of this economic stalemate, especially if we look at more on the positive side, the disruptive capability or capacity of technologies that we can really utilize if we have better economic management, if we make the right decisions. I'll take a step back. Rules and order. I think we're shifting from hyper-globalization to a new form of globalization, which maybe there is more fragmentation, but there's not necessarily less flow of people, goods, services, innovation, ideas. The sooner we know what that looks like, the more clear it'll be what the pathways for growth are going to be. And I think that's important. Maybe we need to be proactive, preempt, start working on these rules, what they look like, and try to build that future consistently and stubbornly, and try to understand it before we have to react to it, especially these days. I'd add maybe a few more points. One, the importance of building the right institutional capabilities and investing in human capital. These are no-regret things that are long-term driven, that need to happen, regardless of what you want to do. Whether you want to utilize a lost opportunity or you want to catch up, these two elements are extremely important. And if you want to leverage the power of technological disruption, generative AI, it's even more important. The more institutionally capable you are, the more the people in your economy and society are ready and more active and more, I'd say, not considered idle capacity, the better you are in a position to leverage and not be left behind. It's important in generative AI, for example, to not just invest, not just to be part of the value chain, but to be a power user. And the more you're a power user, the better value you'll get from technology, but the more talent and innovative momentum you can attract to your economy and to your society. And that's absolutely important. One last point, I think the power of accumulated knowledge. We're working with some universities to address how much knowledge we've accumulated in the Saudi economy and how we can leverage that to fire up new engines of growth or reinvigorate old sectors, which is part of our economic playbook under Vision 2030. There's a lot of power in accumulated knowledge and leveraging it. If you look at Saudi, just to quickly get to Saudi, Vision 2030 is an example of leveraging on all of these opportunities, but also trying to be a voice for shaping a more prosperous future. Because we've invested in our capabilities before, because we've have today structured long-term thinking and economic management that's serious about a long-term restructuring of our economy so that we're more resilient and more ready for future growth.
Thank you, Minister. I will come back to Vision 2030 as well. I think you've actually been incredibly modest, if I may, talking about how a country with such vast mineral wealth and such a huge amount of extreme wealth from one source is actually saying, no, we are going to move, we are going to change, we're going to innovate, we have to diversify in an era of transition as well. I want to come back to Vision 2030 and really drill into it a little bit more, if I may, in a few moments' time. Anna Botín, you have an extremely large global operation in Latin America, United States, Europe, elsewhere as well. You said to me beforehand, you said, I just want to focus on, go really granular on growth itself. Why are we spending so much time talking about growth rather than other parameters as well? Why don't you just fill us in where you feel the actual conversation about growth is absolutely pivotal for this meeting?
Yes, thank you, Steve. It's great to be here. Well, the bottom line is that growth is not an abstraction. It is literally an accelerating growth, actually. It's really at the base of our future prosperity and stability. And I've learned from Larry over the years that putting a few numbers helps. So if the difference between 3% and 5% growth means $3 trillion per year, that's $500 for each person on the planet. That's a huge amount of money that would allow us to pay down debt faster, would allow us to reduce inequality, would allow us to innovate more. So again, this is not an abstraction. It's really the basis of prosperity and stability. So the second question, very briefly, and I'll make 3 points on how. How do we get this growth? And so I think the first very important issue is the context. We are not in the same world as we were 20 years ago. And this is really important. You know, we have geopolitics, you mentioned it, fragmentation. We have to embed sustainability. We need to make sure that we address the AI consequences, because again, this could potentially be huge for the world, but could aggravate the problems. The second one is, you know, and I always like to sort of get to the answer by saying what is not the answer. And my strong belief is that the answer is not, and let me put this in context, too much industrial policy. The answer is in the private sector. It's the private sector that unleashes growth, and we don't have the financing. There's already too much debt. So it's up to the private sector. It's the private sector that's going to create the wealth that we can then redistribute. So we need to think about what ways, and this is government's role, to create the frameworks that allow the private sector to do our job properly. Without going into much more, let me just say 2 things. One is productivity. Obviously, that's the answer, and Draghi said it in his report, and we all know that. But there's another one which is really important, which is, and I say, let's take a pause on regulation and supervision, because that is constraining growth big time. So that would be, in a nutshell, and obviously each one of these points has a lot in itself, how I would think about the why it's important, big numbers, big impact, and how we should address it in today's context, which I think is also crucial.
Anna will come back to a lot of those points, especially about the role of government industrial policy, especially here in Europe, because the thing I'm hearing already here in Davos, and I'll make no bones about it, is Europe. This is the time. It is not Trump we need to look at. It is actually we need to look at why we're not doing the same, why we haven't created a Doge, where the Doge comes up with billions or trillions of dollars worth of efficiency savings or not. It's Europe where we need to be looking at that, not necessarily in the United States. Adina Freeman, you represent an organization which is all about growth. It's all about fostering growth. It's about taking those small companies and making them enormous. There are legions of famous American companies that have grown up on the NASDAQ as well. Growth is in the center of your DNA.
True. So thank you for that, and thank you for being here. I do agree that the nature of NASDAQ and the companies that list on NASDAQ are those that are driving the future of the economy, and therefore they are responsible for driving growth across economies around the world. But I would look at it, I would say that growth is such an important topic and something that we need every government, every element of government and private sector need to be focused on. And I think Anna did a nice job of saying why it's so important. It opens job opportunities. It lifts all boats. We know that. And it also does create stability. And I think that's something that we really have to focus on. And it does not happen by accident. That's the other thing, is I think that people think, there are a lot of policies out there that actually inhibit growth, and the fact we're having 3.3% growth is in a way despite of some of the general approach that governments take. So I look at it as there's so many elements of a system that defines and therefore fosters growth. You have to have an educational system, as we talked about, that allows people to unleash their human potential. You have to have an educational system also that really focuses on innovation and creativity, because I think that is actually a foundation of the future, in terms of unleashing that human potential to think about the future in new ways and to drive growth. Having the rule of law is critically important to support and protect companies and protect people as they bring those ideas forward, and make sure that they have strong protections. And at the same time, having an innovation ecosystem that allows for those innovators to raise capital successfully in multiple stages of their lives. So the very earliest stage all the way up until they're the largest companies. And that funding ecosystem is critically important. But then on top of that, so that's all done within, I would say, a cultural norm that starts to become self-fulfilling. On top of that, then you have to have government policies. And I think, as we've talked about, regulation is a huge element of government policies that can either foster or inhibit growth. Tax policies, the stick and the carrot, right, in terms of inhibiting and fostering certain types of growth. How do you want to take your economy forward? How do you want to unleash the greatest assets you have within your country and make sure that they're used to their fullest potential? And then, of course, then also a global ecosystem. And I'm a huge believer in global capital flows and a global economy. I think globality has been a growth driver for the world. Now we are entering into a new phase of what that looks like in terms of maybe more bilateral agreements, bilateral relationships. Well, still, though, connecting the world together with capital, with ideas, with innovation, and the next generation of innovation, I think, is going to be what continues to drive growth.
Adina, that was almost Trumpian, talking about bilateral organized rather than multilateral. On a day when we're seeing executive orders flying off the shelves about WHO, about COP, or what have you. But bilateral is the way forward. And we know that that's how the administration is going to want to deal going forward as well. I'll come back to that and talk, again, tax policies, global ecosystem. I feel you want to talk about Trump, but you're just not going there necessarily on that answer. Larry, We've talked already about how we're slower, and Anna made the great stats about every percentage of growth makes trillions of dollars worth of difference. But have we just been complacent? Have we been flattered this century? The stat is, since 2000 to 2019, I'm not ignoring you lot, by the way, sorry. I just happened to face this way. Between 2000 and 2019, we grew at 3.7%. Last year, we grew at 3.3%. But come on, you can only industrialize once. China can only grow at 10% and then slow down once. Larry, is it just inevitable that growth has to slow down when you see these amazing, huge emerging economies slow down themselves? They become more mature.
There's plenty who could follow China. But here's the big thing. I've been doing this for 45 years now. There hasn't been a moment when the technological possibilities ahead of the world have been as bright as they are today. Solar energy, considerably cheaper than fossil fuels. down tenfold over the last decade. The possibility that in the life sciences, we're going to get into a world where we see a thing like Wegovy and the semi-glucotides, a miracle drug, a new one every couple of years. And artificial intelligence, I believe artificial intelligence will ultimately be to the internet as the computer was to the calculator. So it is a moment of stunning technological possibility. That does not mean that it's all automatically going to be okay. The 20s were a moment of stunning technological possibility with synthetic fabrics, with the automobile, with widespread electrification, and what followed the 20s wasn't great. So it is a moment of epic challenge for governments in my country and for governments everywhere. And I suggest just 3 or 4 things very quickly that are important. First, with all that opportunity, capital should not be flowing heavily into government debt as an alternative to all that fantastic investment. And 6 of the 7 G7 countries now have debt to GDP ratios above 100%. And in my country, it is further from being on a sustainable path than any time probably in history, because it is unsustainable at a time when we're at full employment. The debts have to be controlled. The system has to be made legitimate and to work for everybody. That wasn't happening. That's what you're seeing in the elections in almost every country. But just because we changed what was doesn't mean it's automatically going to be okay. Finding the formulas that create an inclusive prosperity is going to be essential. 2 other things. No country is going to succeed without teammates in the global economy. No country is going to succeed, and there's an increasing division between an axis of autocracy, North Korea, Russia, China, Iran, and others. And if our strategy starts from alienating those who've been traditionally close to us, I wonder what the consequences of that strategy will be. Yes, striking good bargains is important and a good idea, but let's remember that we need allies if we are going to succeed in this world. And just one last thought. And this is the great possibility in the sort of reconfiguration we're seeing. Everywhere, governments need to understand the central importance of execution. The first way Donald Trump came to prominence as a public figure was when the skating rink in Central Park couldn't get fixed by the public sector, and he fixed it quickly in a way the public sector couldn't. That is a small metaphor for a huge thing that needs to get corrected in our country and everywhere else. And if we can get a government that is less about having new ideas and taking on new missions and responding to new market failures, and more about executing on fighting the fires, keeping the streets safe, collecting the taxes efficiently, and letting businesses function, there are huge potentials ahead in this world.
We have covered a lot of ground already. I want to go through some of these issues as well. You've mentioned the 20s led to the 30s, of course, and there's great stunning innovation like the automobile, which you know, we have a similar level of innovation now. Actually, Larry, I'll come back to you just quickly on this one as well. Why aren't the 2020s going to turn into the 2030s equivalent to what they did a century ago, or are they? You've mentioned a lot of concerns. What is the most obvious policy change that global governments can make to avoid entering the 1930s equivalent?
I think it's, I don't want to choose between the four I said: getting debts under control, maintaining some measure of alliance, making sure that everybody feels like they're part of what's happening, and getting things done effectively. Governments do those four things, great possibilities ahead. They fail, and a lot can go wrong.
This is the bit where we all open it up and we all just get involved as well. But I'm sorry, but getting other countries and allies to go along with you doesn't appear what I heard in the last 24 hours as well. Getting debts under control. No government, Bush, Obama, Biden, Trump again, none of them have got the debts under control. They're getting worse and worse. Tens of trillions of dollars expansion, 6% deficits, the norm in France, the norm in the United States as well. So I am genuinely worried about debts. I am genuinely worried about execution, especially here in Europe as well. And again, the inclusivity of bringing partners along. Someone else come in on here this one as well, because you don't want to hear from me as well. Adina, where do you have your biggest concerns?
Can I say something?
Yes, you can.
Go for it.
So, I mean, I was remembering actually this morning that I was on a panel with Larry just at the beginning of the financial crisis 15 years ago. And one of the key points, and I don't remember exactly the context of the panel, but, you know, thinking about this idea that what is it we need to get growth going, and growth going in the right way with redistribution, thinking about what AI means. And by the way, Larry made a great comment. I asked him, how do you see AI? And one of the things he said, is this something like, you know, the new computer? And he said, no, this is one of three eras in history. We had the agricultural revolution, the industrial revolution, and this is the third, right? So it's incredibly important we get growth, and we get growth the right way. And so, as I said before, I think governments need to give the frameworks, but industrial policy, you know what, even if you like that, we don't have money for that. Again, he just made a point. And in that panel, I used something which I call the four-legged stool, and allow me as a European and financial sector to make the point that the four-legged stool consists of fiscal, monetary policy, structural reforms, obviously there's a lot in there, and yes, the financial sector. Who is the best allocator of resources? It's the market. It's either capital markets, and by the way, in Europe, 90% of all credit to SMEs comes from banks, because we do not have a capital markets union. In the US, you have capital markets, and so how can we unleash the financial sector to better distribute these investments?
But Anna, it's a single market only in name, isn't it? Yeah, but look at what Andrea Ochel's trying to do over in Germany as well. They don't want to know over in Germany. They don't want a single market for banking. CMU. There was a Brit, Lord John Hill, when we were in the EU, by the way, many years ago, who tried to push forward CMU. He was making great strides. We still don't have CMU. We still don't have a plan at the top that's being enacted. We talk about a plan, we talk about Letta, we talk about Draghi. What's going wrong in Europe, Anna? And we've got 10 minutes for that. No, you've got 2 minutes to answer what's going wrong in Europe.
Again, let me tell you what we are not. We are not, respectfully to Larry, a museum. We are at risk of becoming a museum. But who develops the latest vaccines? I mean, a lot of the innovation is actually happening in Europe.
Yeah.
You know, we have a huge amount of startups. Issue is that they start here and then they go to the United States. By the way, in that sense, I don't think they're going to close up, because they would lose a lot of talent and, you know, and growth. So I do think Europe has a diagnosis. I think Europe has a huge opportunity to lead. We're still 5% of the population and 20% of the economy, so we haven't done so badly. And the trick is, and I agree, we're at the crossroads where we can either take the right side, and again, don't think about politics, but I always say Europe has a range of options in economy where we get it right and we can do great. Yeah, and so...
Well, we don't just, Americans innovate, we don't just regulate. You're saying we innovate, then the Americans take those companies over.
But we're starting to understand that. And, you know, the president of the commission just announced an omnibus simplification. I applaud that. There is much more we can do. I said at the conference that we had in November, let's take a pause on regulation and supervision. By the way, this is not different from what the American government wants to do. We just need to do more and faster, and for once, be ahead of the US. And that is
why am I really worried about deregulation? Nothing can ever go wrong with deregulation, especially in the United States, can it? I mean, there's no episodes of that gone wrong last couple of decades.
No, I'm not saying we go back. I'm saying let's take a pause. Let's not do anything more and see what we've done, and then what is it we need in terms of...
But if the US is already innovating, and if the US is already growing at 2.7% in 2025, according to the IMF, and over 3% in 2024, why do we need deregulation?
Oh, okay. I'll give you an interesting stat. So if we look at the world over the last 50 years, and we've done some work with BCG on this, the world itself has gotten about 6 times more complex. Right? There's an enormous amount of complexity that's been brought into the world. And that complexity is both, it can be geopolitical complexity, it can be technological complexity, it's a lot of complexity. But complicatedness, which means how do we process that complexity and drive actual processes and drive for actual practices, has grown 35 times in the last 50 years. So 6 times more complex, 35 times more complicated. And that's because when complexity comes in, if you leave it to governments to manage that complexity, they're going to do it through policies and practices, and they're going to do it through regulation. And when they evaluate regulation, and I operate in a very, very regulated world, what you really want to make sure of, and this is where I think both the US and Europe and others can learn a lot, is they focus more on the inputs than the outputs, meaning they have an idea on how they want to make sure they're regulating certain behaviors to make sure that as let's say, new innovation comes along, or as a financial crisis hits, that they try to protect the population from it. Well, they have an idea on what they want to try to achieve, but through the process of developing that regulation, they're more focused on the check the box on what are the inputs to driving that outcome as opposed to the actual outcome. Wow. So a lot of times the regulation doesn't in fact achieve its outcome, but it creates a lot of complicatedness within an organization. So one of the things we're really focused on in the financial industry, because we now are a very scaled software provider to the industry, risk management, regulatory reporting, et cetera, is how do you simplify this complicatedness? And some of it is through just pure technological progression, meaning taking the latest technologies, cloud and AI, and driving them through the operations of banks and brokers and exchanges and infrastructure, and making it so that there's just more efficiency. But a lot of that's going to have to be also in partnership with the regulators, because the regulators are going to have to allow that to happen. And then the second thing is this idea, instead of calling it deregulation, we like to call it smart regulation.
Right.
Creating a smart regulatory environment that really focuses on outputs, also looks at regulations and realizes there are a lot of regulations on the books that were designed decades ago that probably are no longer relevant, but we're still having to comply. So how do you also create a little bit more of a constant review of regulations to make sure that they're still relevant? But there's a huge amount you can do in smart regulation that allows and actually unleashes growth and unleashes potential and makes, for instance, if you could actually take down just the compliance and regulatory parts of banks by 10 to 20% in terms of operating costs, which is very achievable with technology, that unleashes $25 to $50 billion more in income for every bank, for banks around the world, which if they then took that capital and deployed it into the markets could be like $500 to $1 trillion. $500 billion to $1 trillion of incremental capital deployed in the world.
That's a huge win.
But that's what smart regulation can achieve.
Minister.
So I'll just comment on this and then I'll expand to your earlier question. I think the question about regulation and deregulation, I think it's about the journey of innovation. I think we don't want to pre-regulate, regulate at the right time of the innovative process, and it needs to respond to a specific risk and in engagement with the private sector, not in isolation of the private sector. And then I think it's okay to regulate towards a certain objective after evidence becomes clear. But it's about smart regulation, in my view. Whether it's deregulation, back to the US, whether it's deregulation, industrial policy, trade policy, I think it'll take us a quarter or two to understand what that would look like, exactly what the impact will be. And maybe then a year to understand exactly what that would mean for the global economy. But regardless, I think whatever US economic policy will look like will not just be something that will impact the global economy today and the near future. It'll probably be the seeds towards a long-term restructuring of the global economy. You go to China, I think there's two things. One, they're talking about a new model that today has achieved potentially the 5% target. But what would that model look like with time, and what would that look like with a rivalry or a trade discussion, let's say, with the US? If you go to Europe, and I'm not an expert, I'm just saying, I think whatever Europe's in today, we should not dismiss the power of the accumulated knowledge in the European economy that can, with the right economic management, come back and be activated. And that's something we need to consider when we talk about future of growth. I'll talk a little bit about probably what we need to get out of tepid growth to a better profile, let's say. We need intrepid leadership. And by that we mean bold leadership that's inclusive, disruptive, but constructive, a long-term, really attached to the long-term horizon, but actioning as of today. If you look at Vision 2030 in Saudi Arabia, that's an example of that bold leadership that has led us to plan with confidence, deliver with optimism, but also manage with prudence. The whole objective of Vision 2030 is to detach our economy from, Saudi Arabia's economy, from relying or having to rely on oil inflows and diversify our economy. We've made a lot of progress there. We're closing the year at 3.9%. We expect 25 for non-oil growth. We expect 2025 to be 4.8% and 2026 to be around 6.2%. But that's just GDP, which doesn't tell you everything. We're laying a foundation for a more diversified, productivity-led economic growth story. And the second priority is unlocking the full potential of human capital. That's what really is the long-term, I'd say, play. And here again, institutional capabilities, more capable governments, a more dynamic private sector, a more engaged third sector is going to be useful. And we need to get some questions out of the way as a global economy as well.
Ask you, time is of the essence. Are you worried about debt accumulation at a time when the budget needs $90 a barrel plus? The current oil price is significantly lower than that, with discounts to Asian buyers as well. Are you in a race against time, given the fact that Larry was saying debt accumulation is one of the big concerns he has?
Look, it's about managing with prudence, and for the first time, the Kingdom, under Vision 2030, went from short-term planning to medium-term fiscal frameworks to long-term fiscal planning. And the name of the game is maintaining that long-term view, but having the agility to revise. I'll go back to what Adina said, something I mentioned yesterday, leveraging your assets and capabilities for the optimal return in the long term, keeping in mind the big picture and what future generations need is what's driving Vision 2030 and our momentum behind it.
And one of the things that I think, first of all, just notice the GDP growth that he just mentioned, right? The rest of the world would like that. But one of the things that I find most compelling about how they established Vision 2030 was they focused on KPIs from the very, very beginning. I mean, governments in general, if we could actually have industrial policy that focused on true KPIs and kind of how do we actually drive to the outcome and stay focused on the outcome and make sure all the activity and action is driven towards achieving that outcome. I think that there's so much that the public sector can learn. That is obviously how the great private sector companies operate, but it is seeing an entire country choose an approach like that and having every single person you go to and talk to in the kingdom knows those KPIs. I mean, it's been propagated across the entire population. I think it would be an amazing, amazing enabler for other developed countries to be able to drive that and bring their people with them down that journey.
I'm going to bring Larry in next. Just to put you on notice, think of a couple of questions. I'm going to literally get 2 or 3 in as well, and they will be short as well if you can. So just putting you on notice for questions as well. Larry Summers.
I think Adina made the crucial point that we need to distinguish between smart regulation and dumb regulation, not between regulation and no regulation. Nobody can look at the American experience with fentanyl, the fact that the financial crisis happened, the way fire safety was regulated in Los Angeles, and the experience of those of us who have young daughters, teenage daughters, with social media, and think that the only problems are of non-regulation or under-regulation. And nobody could engage in being regulated without thinking that there are massive excesses. So we need to reframe the debate around having smart regulation dumb, rather than more or less. As long as it's just more or less, it's going to be completely sterile. Anna, I sure hope you're right about Europe, because I think an immense amount about how our planet evolves depends on what happens in Europe. I have to say that just as I was kind of starting out as an economist, we had a wave in the United States, people associated with Ronald Reagan, but it actually began with Jimmy Carter, who deregulated planes, deregulated pipelines, deregulated trucks, and then there was more in the 80s. And I have to say, I don't see it. I don't see anything that looks like the United States major deregulation force in Europe right now. And until I do, I suspect that there's going to be a Lagarde report 6 years from now that's going to sound sort of like the Draghi report.
So we know the recipe.
I sure hope I'm wrong, but I can't say I'm hugely optimistic as I watch from a distance.
Okay, one quick round. I want to ask you what tariffs and protectionism and trade barriers means to the prospect for growth in 2025. It's coming, unless it's just one big transaction and we're all going to live happily ever after and deals are going to get done left, right and centre with Mexico, with Canada, with the EU, with the UK and with China, etc. as well. First of all, with you, Minister, as well, what does the oncoming onset of tariffs and more protectionism mean for growth in your domain?
Well, Steve, I think it's about what this new form of globalization will look like. As far as the U.S. new economic policy will have to
deglobalization.
Well, less than hyper-globalization. Let me put it this way, different than hyper-globalization, but still we see an increase, a continuous increase in flows. I think we'll have to understand what the U.S.'s final policy will look like and understand its impact. But it's time for more economic integration regionally and more clear bilateral, let's say, arrangements or agreements that help protect the flow of and trade and flow of goods and services, ideas and people, for us to continue unlocking more avenues of growth.
But a very quick follow-up. Are American policies, as spoken about already under the 47th President of the United States, a direct threat to the kingdom, which has been a reliable supplier of oil to the United States for decades? I've been covering OPEC for decades. I've had some great interaction with various of your energy ministers, if I may say so, including Mr. Al-Naimi, which is on YouTube, and it was interesting interaction. And but given that you've been a reliable partner, is it a direct threat to the kingdom?
So the kingdom is more integrated in the global economy. More of the stuff we do at home in terms of unlocking the potential impacts not just the region, but the global economy, and vice versa. We're always assessing what policies will look like and how we need to respond, but we're relying on dialogue and continued mutual benefit, additional, I'd say, value-adding relationships. With the U.S., we've had a long-standing, strong relationship that spanned 8 decades, regardless of which administration. It was strong regardless of which administration was in office, and we look forward to continuing the discussion with this administration.
Anna, the biggest threat from tariffs and trade protectionism and deglobalization for your world?
Well, we all know what happens, and again, Larry was referring to the 20s and 30s. I think we're missing the bigger point, though. The elephant in the room right now is, tariffs on goods, cars, and things we build. Our economy is 70–80% services. What is the trade balance in services between Europe and the US? I don't think there's data on that. And how much are we buying in terms of software services, cloud services, financial services from American firms? And that's great because they do it very well. So I think tariffs, I hope we think carefully about what it means to put tariffs on German cars when we are buying so many things from the US because they're making a lot of the tech services that are powering the economy right now. So, I don't think that's an obvious one to launch without thinking what it means.
Okay, Adina?
I mean, well, first of all, I believe that we should be at least striving for global capital flows, global economy, all the things that we've seen have worked over several decades. I think tariffs, to me, are a political tool that are used to drive certain behaviors. Sometimes it can be to level a playing field, competitive playing field. Sometimes it can be to drive certain industrial policy in terms of trying to create more jobs at home. But I also would say that they all have knock-on effects on the economy. And we have to always remind ourselves as what are all the law of unintended consequences? What are all the unintended consequences of making, let's say, input prices higher for your American companies to be able to build a final product versus making the final product more expensive in one country or another? Those things can have a lot of knock-on effects that ultimately hit the consumer. And I do think that the government is going to be very focused on the American consumer. So to the extent that the tariffs have an impact on the American consumer, particularly on inflation, I think they're going to be very mindful of that before they do anything.
And a quick minute from Larry on this one.
35 times as many people work in U.S. industries that use steel and aluminum as work in the steel and aluminum industries. That has to speak to the merits or demerits of putting tariffs on to protect steel and aluminum, as has been done on a bipartisan basis. Tariffs are a self-imposed supply shock. They raise the price and they reduce the quantity that's available to buy. Supply shocks are not good for economies. Yes, there's bargaining. Yes, there's certain circumstances involving national defense, but economists are famous for disagreeing on things. But I think there is no proposition that would command more universal agreement across the economics profession than the idea that the sustained application of broad-based tariffs apart from particular purpose is not likely to be economically positive.
Thanks, Larry. First question. Do you know what? This gentleman over here had his hand up first of all. Let's get that one in. Can you make it really quick? Because, as ever, I've gone way over.
Thank you for the floor.
You've got a microphone there, I think.
Thank you for the floor. My name is Lucas Kistler. I'm a global shaper, politician, and architect representing the DAVOS Hub. My question would be how to decouple economic growth from resource exploitation and carbon emissions.
Okay, who wants to pick up on that one? How do we decouple economic growth from
clean technology?
Innovation's the answer.
Clean technology is the only answer to that question, and it looks far more possible today than it did 10 years ago.
Okay.
No, I was talking in the context of Saudi. I mean, it's diversifying our sources of growth, having to rely on more than one channel that brings that flow from more than one exported product. We have the resources and the assets and capabilities to advance our industrial complex so we can export more competitively, direct our incentives towards a more competitive set of non-oil exports, and then put in some fiscal measures that really shield our economy from relying on a single commodity price as we transition from one structure to another, which kind of we are in the middle of at the moment.
Very smart regulation, and let the market do the transition. Because the elephant in the room is who pays for the transition. You know, Santander, we have 170 million customers, many of which are in Brazil, Mexico, developing economies. We cannot ask these countries to do what we're asking, you know, Spain or the Netherlands. So we need the market to, you know, market-driven solutions with some kind of a simple, smart regulation, which is not the case today.
Adina, I'm just going to try and get one or two more questions in. There is any ladies want a question? Oh, there's a lady here, and then I'm going to ask this gentleman over there who's been very patient. That will be the last questions, I'm afraid, as well. So one here and then one there. In fact, why don't we get both questions? We'll get yours, and then we'll get this gentleman's question, and then we'll get them to the panel.
Hi, Sue Chan from The Telegraph. My question is for Anna Botan. This panel is about the future of growth. There's a lot of speculation about Santander's future in the UK because of regulations stifling that growth. I just wondered, is the UK a good place to do business, and what could it do better?
So we'll get to that one in a moment. I've already spoken to Charlie Nunn this morning, who refused to answer me on that question, by the way, he of Lloyds. And this gentleman's question over here, if we can just get a mic to this gentleman. Or if he can bellow, he looks like he can.
If we do further on, Europe is a bureaucratic monster. We have seen how Saudi has done the last 10 years in really creating an environment for growth. So it's more about, for Farhan and for Ibrahim, what is really necessary? The analysis is there. Europe has taken themselves out of the game for the last 10 years with this bureaucracy. What has to happen that Europe comes back? Is it more political union or even less? Or if we stay forward that way, Europe 10 years doesn't matter anymore.
All right, so thank you. Is it political union or economic union to complete the single market? Anna, why don't you... Well, Adina, you come in first on the other, and I'll give you one more minute to get ready for Sue's question.
It's half a second. Sorry to interrupt. So we love the UK. It's a co-market and will remain a co-market for Santander. Punto. That's it.
So you are not going to be selling the Abbey National Network?
It's a co-market and will remain a co-market for Santander into the future.
Sue, I think you just got some news there for the Daily Telegraph as well. Minister,
I'll take a
Adina,
little bit
yes.
And you can quote me, by the way.
So,
this is not off the record.
In addition to the US, we also own and operate markets across the Nordic countries in Europe. So we are actually quite engaged in the European markets, and we're very engaged in the CMU discussions, the Capital Markets Union discussions. There are layers and layers of regulation, because you've got national regulation and regional regulation. That has got to change. They've got to start to think about who are the national, what elements of society and community have to be regulated by a national regulator, and what elements should be regulated by a regional regulator. And we would say the capital markets across Europe, you know, it is a very strong economic alliance if it actually manifests itself as a strong economic alliance. I think if they start to think about, and I think the Draghi report, which we mentioned a lot, is spot on. It's not just about creating a regulatory framework, but it's also about driving an innovation ecosystem, encouraging through tax policies investor or consumers and citizens in Europe to invest in equities, invest in growth, and therefore deploy their capital to the innovation ecosystem, getting pensions to make sure that they're thinking more deliberately around how they manage their investments into the European ecosystem, in addition to global investments, and then driving a regulatory framework where you have more regional regulation across markets with local regulation for things that really drive domestic growth, right? And I think that it's very solvable. It's just a matter of the will. There's a way if there's the will.
Got a big sign that says time out. Final word from the Minister.
Two things. I agree, tariffs need to be objective-driven and time-bound. But to your question, I'm not an expert on Europe, but I think long-term thinking, structured long-term thinking, there needs to be some boldness in innovation and policy-making, engaging and making the space for the private sector to co-lead and lead while remaining supportive. But lastly, something we really dismiss a lot, which is optimism. And optimism is not a gut reaction to something. It takes courage to decide to be optimistic. And I think that's what we did in Vision 2030 in the beginning. And I believe, if you look, I don't know if this is the right thing to mention, but if you look at Dave Chappelle's monologue on a show, on a sister over the weekend, the last bit of it, you'll see that there's seeds of optimism everywhere. And I really think it's our job and everyone's job to nurture it and grow it and continue to maintain it. It always works.
I will leave it there. Oh, go on, Anna, I've got a final word. Do you know how much trouble I'm in?
He mentioned me, so I have to be, you know, well-educated. So I think Europe needs to change its attitude towards risk. You know, we need to take more risk. This is what the Americans do really well. And by the way, we know how to do it. We cannot protect every single citizen in the UK, in Europe, against everything that can go wrong. So change our culture, our attitude towards risk.
And that's optimism.
And that's the final word, yeah? Okay, word. Innovation AI, smart regulation, debt management, collaboration, better attitude to risk, bilateral collaboration, let's see how that one works, tariffs, the uniformity, the economists don't like it as well. Getting capital to the right place. The two final ones I like, execution of your strategy, know your KPIs, and optimism. Can I just say thank you to Larry Summers, thank you to Adina Friedman, Anna Botín, and His Excellency Faisal Al Ibrahim. Thank you very much, and thank you to you.